Good afternoon, and welcome to the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion, hosted by the Clean Air Task Force. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we have a really exciting and interesting panel discussion we're about to launch into. My name is Jonathan Lewis. I am the director of the Clean Air Task Force's Transportation Decarbonization Program. Today's event is called How Transnational Cooperation Can Enable Global Decarbonization in the Marine Shipping and Aviation Sectors. I'm going to offer some quick framing thoughts, and then I'll hand things over to our very distinguished panel. Designing, legislating, and implementing policies to reduce climate-forcing emissions can be a slow and difficult process, almost regardless of which industry and which emission stream is being targeted by regulation. The policy-making process for addressing emissions is especially difficult for the marine sector and the aviation sector. Aviation and marine are often considered among the hardest to decarbonize sectors for a variety of techno-economic reasons. They need to carry an enormous amount of energy with them to complete their long journeys, often laden with very heavy freight. And the weight to ratio energy of batteries complicates the use of electrification in many or even most uses in these sectors. Fortunately, zero carbon fuels like hydrogen and ammonia can play a big role in aviation and marine decarbonization, but we need to bring down the cost of these fuels while eliminating emissions from their production processes. Those challenges aren't the challenges we're focused on in this panel today, however. The challenges we're focused on here are more legal and political. The Kyoto Protocol addressed greenhouse gas emissions from international aviation and shipping, but it treated those sectors differently than other sectors because the sectors, planes and ships, frequently operate in international spaces. The protocol established that emission reductions from the aviation and marine sectors were to be pursued through the International Civil Aviation Organization, known as ICAO, and the International Maritime Organization, known as IMO. For the past couple decades, ICAO and IMO have organized GHG emission reduction regulatory processes and regularly report progress on their work to the UNFCCC. From CATF's perspective, this approach is not going particularly well. The two industries emit about 2 billion tons of CO2 per year. Eliminating those emissions is critically important to national and global climate goals, yet both ICAO and IMO have adopted measures that essentially require a 50% reduction in emissions by mid-century. That's literally a half measure. We need to do more. State actors have started to look for actions that they can take to do more to reduce aviation sector and marine sector emissions more fully. Policymakers in Europe, the United States, and other jurisdictions have a clear opportunity to step in as first movers by developing transnationally aligned emission reduction policies that can lead the world toward developing international standards and certifications. The objective of this event is to discuss ways that transnational cooperation can chart the course for global decarbonization of some of the hardest to abate sectors in the world economy. I hope we'll identify some new cooperative strategies that might be pursued, including some of the very interesting and very promising new initiatives that have been announced here at COP. But we're also very fortunate to have some existing examples of efforts to achieve transnational policy alignment in these spaces. One of those examples is playing out in the marine shipping context, where Europe has taken a big step forward through its development of the FuelEU maritime policy. We are therefore very fortunate to be joined today by Jutta Paulus, member of the European Parliament for the Greens EFA since 2019. She sits on the Environment, Public Health, and Food Safety Committee, the Industry, Research, and Energy Committee, and the Transport Committee. She has been the rapporteur for the revision of EU regulations for monitoring, reporting, and verification of shipping emissions. And Jutta has started her career as a pharmacist, co-founded an independent laboratory for the examination of chemical hazards, and worked in quality management. From 2017 to 2019, she was the regional co-president of Rhineland-Palatinate Greens. The shipping emissions reduction targets in Europe's FuelEU maritime policy served as both a guide and a benchmark for the development of a bill in the U.S. House of Representatives called the Clean Shipping Act of 2022. We'll learn more about that policy from Andrew Bauer, who is joining us virtually through pre-recorded remarks. Andrew is the legislative director to Congressman Alan Lowenthal, who is the lead sponsor of the Clean Shipping Act. Representative Lowenthal serves as the senior member of the Maritime Subcommittee of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committees and has represented California's 47th district, including the Port of Long Beach, since January 2013. Andrew has worked for Congressman Lowenthal in a variety of roles since 2017. He currently coordinates the transportation and maritime policy and serves as the lead staffer for the Congressional Port Caucus. After Andrew, we'll hear from Allyson Browne of Pacific Environment. Allyson serves as Pacific Environment's Climate Campaign Manager for ports, leading their Ports for People campaign to end port and ship pollution. She's contributed to renewable energy, climate, and sustainability policy for more than 10 years, including as Director of Regulatory Affairs for SREC Trade and as Chief of Staff to Jared Blumenfeld for California Governor Gavin Newsom's 2018 gubernatorial campaign. To kick things off, though, it is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Wishnia, who serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy in the Office of Assistant Secretary of Transportation Policy in the United States Department of Transportation. Andrew previously served as a U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, including as Senior Policy Advisor, and also served at the Federal Highway Administration as Special Assistant for Policy to FHWA Administrator, and as a Senior Program Manager at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. He previously served in the U.S. House of Representatives as a legislative assistant to Congressman John Yarmouth, now the chairman of the U.S. House Committee on Budget. After Andrew speaks, we'll hear from Jutta, then Andrew Bauer, then Allyson Browne. And we'll follow that with some discussion among the panelists. Andrew, may I invite you to make some remarks among the steps that first mover jurisdictions can take to pursue transnational alignment in climate policy, particularly in contexts like aviation and marine, where international technical bodies like ICAO and IMO have a significant role. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Solutions Day. So I'm Andrew Wishnia. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy at the Department of Transportation. Sorry about that, Jonathan. So it's great to be with you all. My role at the U.S. Department of Transportation is to make our transportation system cleaner, help improve the resilience of our transportation system, and help permitting processes become more efficient and effective without undermining environmental protections. You know, emissions from international aviation and international shipping have posed a challenge for international climate policy, going all the way back to COP1 in 1995 in Berlin, when the parties couldn't agree on who was responsible for the emissions of a ship or plane traveling between countries. The country of departure, the country of arrival, the citizenship of the passengers, or the plane or the owners of the cargo of the ship. In 1987, at COP3, the parties agreed that these emissions should be addressed in the UN agencies responsible for these sectors, namely the IMO for ships and the ICAO for aircraft. In the case of ICAO, it has underpinned the safety, efficiency, and competitiveness of modern aviation through the development of some 10,000 standards and recommended practices. In particular, ICAO has established a set of environmental standards for emissions of NOx, CO2, and non-volatile particulate matter. And in a landmark assembly just last month, ICAO member states adopted 2 globally significant resolutions on climate change. These resolutions were supported by the overwhelming majority of member states, as well as by the aviation industry, including by the International Air Transport Association, IATA, which represents 85% of the world's airlines, and the International Coordinating Council of Aerospace Industry Associations. The first ICAO Assembly resolution adopted just last month reaffirmed and strengthened CORSIA as the flagship instrument by which ICAO member states are addressing the carbon emissions of international flights. CORSIA now requires, for the years 2024 to 2035, airlines to reduce, to offset, or to use sustainable aviation fuels to address any carbon emissions above a level set at 85% of their 2019 emissions. So some 118 states constituting more than 3/4 of international aviation emissions volunteer to participate in CORSIA in the pilot phase. The rebound in aviation activity that we're now seeing, you know, most of us took international flights to get here, yes? The rebound, coupled with the Assembly's strengthening of CORSIA, means that CORSIA's emission reduction obligations are expected to kick in starting immediately after CORSIA's pilot phase in 2024. Recognizing this, the industry is starting now to make significant investments in all 4 elements of the ICAO basket of measures: more efficient equipment, better operations, sustainable aviation fuels, and yes, high integrity offsets. These investments are also designed to help the industry meet the second ICAO Assembly resolution adopted last month, namely the establishment of a collective long-term aspirational goal, or LTAG, for international aviation of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Together, the CORSIA and LTAG Assembly resolutions send a powerful signal, including, and importantly to the investment community, that nations and the industry recognize that the future of aviation depends on its ability to decarbonize. I would like to point out 3 key provisions undergirding these resolutions. 1, common metrics for measuring the emissions of international aviation. 2, common metrics for measuring on a life cycle basis the benefits of sustainable aviation fuels. 3, a common set of metrics for measuring and safeguarding the environmental integrity of carbon credits used to offset emission increases. These key provisions took years to develop in ICAO, but they're now enabling better investments across each of the elements of the basket of measures. The United States is proud to have worked with so many nations and partners at the ICAO Assembly to advance these 2 resolutions and their key provisions. I want to particularly commend the leading roles that our partners, in Brazil and India and the United Arab Emirates played and will continue to play at ICAO to advance the aviation of today and of tomorrow. I'm also proud to highlight President Biden's signature of the landmark Inflation Reduction Act, which includes strong fiscal and policy incentives for producing sustainable aviation fuels. These incentives will help us meet the SAF grand challenge of 3 billion gallons of high integrity SAF by 2030 and 35 billion gallons by 2050. Turning to the IMO, the US is currently working with other countries in the IMO to help ensure that the revised IMO GHG strategy includes levels of ambition that can send a clear signal to markets that the shipping sector has a zero emission future. The United States has proposed a date of no later than 2050 to phase out GHG emissions from international shipping to zero, in line with a 1.5 degree goal. So we have also proposed to strengthen the level of ambition for 2030 and levels of ambition for 2040, both absolute emission reduction goals and intensity reduction goals, to put us on a credible path towards zero emission by mid-century. And we have proposed new formulations for the 2030 and 2040 levels of ambition that can serve as indicators of the transition to zero emission shipping. Specifically, we have suggested specifying a percentage of the global fleet operating on fuels and technologies with zero or near zero emissions, so 5% by 2030 and 50% by 2040. So we're really excited about raising the sector's global ambition, and we're eager to see the implementation of the types of initiatives that have been rolled out thus far at COP. But what is also crucial to progress is ensuring that these measures and the future work at the IMO proceed on the basis of the kinds of common metrics that undergird the ICAO framework for measuring emissions, for measuring the benefits of sustainable maritime fuels on a life cycle basis, and for measuring and safeguarding the integrity of carbon credits. IMO can build on the extensive work already done in ICAO. IMO does not need to reinvent these. That's why we're eager to work with partners on green shipping corridors and other approaches while building toward those common metrics in the partnership and at ICAO. We look forward to working with you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Jutta, the floor is yours. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, very much. And I'll take it from here. It's easier to keep people also in the view. And I would like to tell you a bit about the different legislative procedures which are right now being negotiated at the European level. So I'll start with aviation. There we have the Refuel EU Aviation proposal, which is also looking at sustainable aviation fuels. And there the ongoing negotiations are actually now at the point where the Parliament, which has already agreed on a position, and the Council of Member States, which has also already agreed on a position, are negotiating with each other in the so-called trilogue, with the Commission at the table as the honest broker, as it is called. So at the end of this process, we should have the refuel aviation regulation, which is then applied to all European airports upwards from a certain number of passengers per year, which is a number which is still under negotiation. So I cannot tell you exactly what will be the outcome, of course. And then also we will have a phase in. So of course we'll start with the biggest airports, and then it will go down to smaller airports. But of course, at the end of the day, we are aiming for a zero-emission aviation. And for that goal, it is my firm belief that the industry needs investment security. So if the industry knows, okay, we will have to have drop in SAFs or other means of zero-emission fuels by year 2030, for example, then they know, okay, we should invest now. Because if we want to keep landing and starting at European airports, we will have to comply with that guideline. And there are different models right now on whether it should be applied to each and every plane, or whether there should be sort of a book and claim system, so that, for example, if you are operating at 10 different airports, you are tankering SAFs only at one airport and then sort of distributed virtually to the other airports. This is ongoing discussion, so I can't say what will be the outcome. My personal view is that we should not make too many exemptions, and that we should take care that there is no double counting at the end of the day. Because if there is no exemption, if you say, okay, you'll have to have those 2% or 5% or wherever we might land in the end, then of course each and every airport has to make sure that this is available. And I often get asked, well, but we don't have the infrastructure for delivering those SAFs. Well, my idea is not that each airport has a special tank for SAFs where it then mixes the ready-to-use air fuel at the airport, but that of course this should be done at the refinery, because no airport is situated right next to the refinery. So the fossil kerosene today also has to be delivered to the airport somehow. My personal goal in negotiating for the ITRE committee the opinion to the Refuel EU Aviation was to give a push to really future-proof fuels. Because I know right now the most cost-efficient option is biofuels. But take a globe, the landmass on this planet is limited. And we will not discover any new continents where we can grow biofuels. And we are already experiencing so much pressure on land for the production of food, for reserving space for nature. Everyone here is talking about nature-based solutions. Well, if you don't set aside land for those nature-based solutions, they will simply not materialize. And also we have to take into account, we just passed 8 billion people, and the population on the planet will probably grow further. So I think we should look at solutions that are using the land most efficiently. And there, the e-fuels, which produce clean fuels from electricity via hydrogen to synthetic kerosene, would make much more efficient use of the land. For example, if you produce the land which you would need to produce 1 unit of biofuel, could produce 40 times the amount of electricity by using solar, and 100 times the amount of electricity by using wind. So even if you count in the conversion losses which inevitably come with turning electricity to hydrogen and then hydrogen to clean fuels, you're still more efficient than growing biofuels on this land. So we have to take this into account, and we also have to take into account that biofuels today are produced with a lot of fertilizer, which is today produced using fossil gas. And you also have to count in the agricultural machines which you would need to grow those biofuels. So in my view, the way into a clean future would be to incentivize e-fuels in Refuel EU Aviation, and now making the link also in Fuel EU Maritime, because it has been said maritime has, as aviation, the challenge that you will never be able to run a ship running from, let's say, Los Angeles to Shanghai, or from Singapore to Rotterdam on batteries. This will simply not work. So you will need a chemical energy carrier, and there different options are right now explored in research and development. For example, Maersk, which is one of the biggest shipping companies in Europe, they're planning to have their first zero-emission ships on the sea by 2030, using either ammonia or methanol. If you produce synthetic methanol with direct air capture, so that you capture the CO2 from the air and then burn it in the ship or use a fuel cell and re-emit it into the air, this is a zero carbon game if you take it from the air. Of course, it's not a zero carbon game if you use, for example, a cement factory or something, but still this would be better having one more cycle than emitting the CO2 directly in the air. In Fuel EU Maritime, we have basically the same challenge, so we need a common metrics. I'm happy to hear that the US have already worked on this and that there is international movement finally at IMO and ICAO, because in the last years I was a delegate to the IMO and I was quite, a bit depressed hearing what different delegations had to say at the IMO, because they were all like, well, shipping is a global business and shipping is so important for the world's economy, we shouldn't do anything. So now they're down to, okay, we should do at least 50%, which is of course still not enough. The United Nations Environmental Programme figured out that if they would hold true to their promise, then shipping and aviation alone would take up half of the remaining carbon budget in 2050, which is not the way forward. So there too we need regulatory pushes, and the European approach is to have every ship entering a European port or exiting a European port would have to tanker a partly sustainable maritime fuels. This could be biofuels, no food and feed crops, but biofuels from, for example, agricultural waste, which I think is not exactly what we should focus on. But also we are talking about quotas for renewable fuels of non-biological origin, which would be e-fuels. Unfortunately, we did not manage in the negotiation to get a text in about black carbon. Black carbon is a short-time climate forcer, which is especially destructive in the Arctic ecosystem. Therefore, we would have loved to take black carbon up, but right now we're only looking at the CO2 emissions and also methane emissions, which are, of course, a very important factor. And on top of Fuel EU Maritime, the EU will include shipping in the emission trading system, so that each ship will have to buy emission certificates for their CO2 and hopefully soon methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And of course, this will put additional pressure on the maritime sector, but I have to say, this regulation is completely neutral. It's flag neutral, it's neutral of ownership, it's neutral of commercial operator, it's neutral of cargo or passengers, so it'll address each and every ship entering European ports. It will start with a phase-in phase, which is being negotiated right now, and it will cover first 50% of the voyage. So if the ship runs from Shanghai to Rotterdam, then 50% of the journey will be covered by the ETS, and we plan to expand it to 100% unless the respective country of origin also has a carbon pricing scheme in place. So this is our approach to make a global push to pricing maritime emissions. I'll leave it at that. I've already talked too long, I believe. Sorry.
Not at all. Not at all. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. We are going to hear next from Andrew Bauer, who is the staff for U.S. Representative Lowenthal from the California 47th District. His comments are recorded. He couldn't join us today, but we'll run his video right now.
My name is Andrew Bauer. I'm the legislative director for Congressman Lowenthal, who represents California's 47th district. He has had the privilege of representing the city of Long Beach in council, the California State Assembly and Senate, and now in Congress for a now 30-year political career. And throughout that time, the port and its environmental impact have been at the heart of his mission. He is a senior member of the House Natural Resources Committee and a senior member of the Transportation Committee, where he, of course, serves on the Maritime Subcommittee responsible for the U.S. maritime system. I have served with the congressman in a variety of roles since 2017, but am now his chief policy advisor in the transportation space. Congressman Lowenthal announced his retirement in December of this year, before the introduction of the Clean Shipping Act. But together with our outstanding co-lead, Congresswoman Nanette Barragan, who represents the Port of LA, next door to us, the bill will continue on and has a future ahead in future Congresses. Although the Port of Long Beach is at the heart of the Long Beach economy and a critical freight corridor, nationally, there's no secret that it has significant environmental impacts. NOx and other hazardous emissions have spiked over the course of the pandemic. That's in many ways due to the congestion directly caused by vessels idling off of our coast and increasing emissions there, in addition to the diesel emissions impact. His earliest experiences in activism in Long Beach were driven by the realization and the awareness that in frontline communities around the port, asthma rates are disproportionately high, cancer rates are disproportionately high. The life expectancy in those communities is years lower than it is in the Los Angeles County average. And that's not confined to Long Beach. In fact, the Southern California ports have unusually good environmental records by United States standards. The fact is that 40% of Americans live within 3 miles of a port, and there are huge impacts that show up in congressional districts all over the country and communities all over the country that the Clean Shipping Act can help to address. The Clean Shipping Act was born out of awareness of the public health impacts of the ocean shipping industry, but also of the enormous climate impact. We are very supportive of IMO and international efforts to crack down, but the fact is that the IMO's current 2050 decarbonization goals are not in keeping with the Paris Climate Accords emission reduction goals, and more aggressive action is needed. Working with a wide array of industry and activist groups representing communities all over the country, we narrowed in on this approach, many ways to complement the Fuel EU's Fit for 55 legislative package, which of course other panelists will address. And we have laid out a series of targets that we believe and that industry players and technical experts believe are feasible to get us to zero emission shipping by 2040. These are ambitious goals, and as they're implemented, the EPA will have flexibility to make sure that goals are being implemented in an aggressive but practical way. But we believe that that they can be accomplished. The fact is that the bill has numerous environmental and economic and public health rationale. First off, we believe that green technology is the future. These are huge industries waiting to be unlocked. But the bill, even just by being introduced, we believe sends very important demand signals to investors, to industry players, to the market, that decarbonization is coming, and it's time for all actors, whether that's in the private sector or in government, to put their money where their mouth is, to make the investments that need to be made to hit these goals. The next generation of fuel technology, the next generation of shipbuilding, the next generation of maritime technology are huge industries that we believe can benefit the economies all over the country. The benefits for public health and for the economy of slashing, chronic, disparate public health impacts of maritime pollution are obviously enormous as well. The costs of asthmas, of cancers, of other conditions are enormous. If we can't confront climate change, we are facing instability across metrics that will make the disruptions of the post-COVID era pale by comparison. We don't have a choice to act here. This is we have an imperative to decarbonize. There are costs associated with that. There are far greater costs associated with inaction. We recognize that a nation-state approach raises compliance costs and headaches. It creates infrastructure challenges in terms of the ability to support different technologies that may be used internationally. And we are very strongly supportive of an IMO approach. The fact is that we don't believe that the IMO has been moving aggressively enough. And in some ways, we hope that the introduction of this bill focuses minds and helps to build pressure for an international approach that in some ways would be preferable for industry actors. Congressman Lowenthal has represented California for many years. We have seen firsthand the degree to which California has been able to lead the United States into more aggressive climate action on issue after issue and front after front. And so we believe that if the EPA can do for the world what CARB, the California Air Resources Board, does for the United States, then we can really unlock some of the barriers to global action in this critical area. So the Fuel EU policy obviously is in some ways more comprehensive than the Clean Shipping Act. That's a function of political process of European Union parliamentary rulemaking compared with an approach very much rooted in the American legal traditions of the Clean Air Act. But we have taken enormous inspiration from the goals and the mechanisms of the bill. And we hope to achieve strong regulatory alignment to facilitate the well-being of critical, trade and freight flows as these two policies are rolled out. We have included in the bill at the request of and advice of partners and stakeholders in industry that the administrator of the EPA has the authority to essentially waive the provisions of the Clean Shipping Act after implementation if it can be demonstrated that the IMO or other international bodies have adopted equal or more aggressive decarbonization standards. We recognize, and many of our partners and collaborators have pointed out, this bill is not an all-encompassing solution to the issues of maritime decarbonization. In many ways, it builds on recent efforts through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act to provide huge resources to decarbonize the ports, the maritime sector, to develop alternative fuels and alternative energy means. But there's a lot of work left to be done. Stakeholders are always sharing the obstacles that they face to fully decarbonizing, and the bill will, of course, need to be paired with comprehensive approaches to make sure that these changes are feasible and practical. We were very proud of some of the ongoing work internationally, specifically in the port of Long Beach, to develop trans-Pacific hydrogen corridors, to leverage the resources of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, to start to work towards the goals of the Clean Shipping Act. But we fully recognize that there are hurdles left to address that will need to be paired with a policy goal of setting these emissions reduction targets.
Allyson, I know you've been directly involved with a lot of the efforts that Andrew just discussed. So I would like to turn it over to you to talk about Pacific Environment's efforts in these areas.
Great, thank you. And I'll be brief so we can get to our discussion because I want to hear more from our esteemed panelists here that are on the stage with me. But my name's Allyson Browne. I'm a climate campaign manager with Pacific Environment. We're a global nonprofit, and we work on a variety of climate and environmental issues, not just shipping. We work on plastics. We also have been working on black carbon in the Arctic for years. And we have consultative status at the IMO that my colleagues have been working and representing Pacific Environment and grassroots advocacy organizations at the IMO for many years. And as John mentioned, we are fierce advocates and supporters of the U.S. Clean Shipping Act. We have been partnering with Representative Lowenthal and Bargon very, very hard, working very hard to promote this policy in the U.S. And our campaign Ports for People is a local bottom-up campaign to collaborate with our partners on the ground. So working with environmental justice, public health, community, and climate action groups to encourage ports to accelerate efforts to decarbonize, reduce emissions, reduce pollution at the ports, and also to ensure a just transition for port communities in a sustainable way. Obviously, the ports require a lot of people to operate them, and we want to make sure that they have jobs in the just transition and in the clean energy future. So that's certainly a priority of our campaign. And with that, I hand it back over to John, and happy to jump into discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for some great discussions. Jutta, I'd like to go to you first. Europe has led the way for years on many of these policy fronts, including policies that impact transportation emissions that occur outside of Europe. Two examples being FuelEU Maritime and the extension of the emissions trading system to carbon dioxide emitted by marine ships traveling internationally to and from Europe. Europe has demonstrated a willingness to act first, but the effectiveness of those actions will be multiplied if they encourage other regions and countries around the world to pursue similar policies, as we've been discussing today. So my first question is, When you and other policymakers are crafting climate policy in Europe, do you think about how different targets or features might inspire similar steps by policymakers outside of Europe? My second question is, do you and other leading climate policy designers in Europe look at policies being developed in other regions and countries and think about ways that EU policy might align with those outside of EU policies?
Interesting questions. Actually, of course, we are looking at what is happening outside the EU. I mean, it is not the first attempt to, for example, put aviation in the ETS. We had this approach in 2013 where the European Union tried to include aviation fully in the emission trading system, and at the end of the day failed, because the international community was not ready to work on this. So at the end of the day, aviation was included only for intra-EU flights. So, which is of course the smaller part of the emission which comes from aviation, because if you look at how much emissions come from a flight from, let's say, Berlin to Madrid, this is of course a fraction of the emissions from Frankfurt to New York. So yes, exactly. So yes, of course, we are looking at what happens outside, and I think this was actually the encouragement to say we have to take bolder steps, because the way the world moves on aviation and shipping is too slow, especially when it comes to maritime, because ships sail the sea for such a long time. I think the average age of a ship when it's being decommissioned is more than 30 years. So the ships that are built today will still be on the sea by 2050. So, and having watched the lacking progress at the IMO for so long, I'm really happy that the EU finally decided to step forward. And we even have a precedent for that, because my first file in the European Parliament was the MRV regulation, monitoring, reporting, verification of CO2 emissions from maritime transport. This entered into force, or this was negotiated in 2016, and it was applied to the European economical area, because the IMO could not deliver. The IMO was asked to develop such a scheme, and they never did. And so the EU decided, okay, if you're not acting, then we will do something at least for our region. And as soon as the MRV was approved, IMO came up with a data collection system. So it is sort of attempting the same here, saying, okay, we'll do something here, and if IMO is smart, they can learn from the experience, and they could take this as a blueprint from a market-based measure, because the IMO wants to develop a market-based measure to reduce emissions. And wouldn't it be great to have something in place where we already can collect experiences? So basically, this is not only for looking at the emissions we ourselves are responsible for, but also for living up to the promise of Paris of the Ambition Coalition. Because being an Ambition Coalition does mean to take domestic action, but to also look what can we do in order to promote climate action worldwide. And I forgot to say something about the COSIA approach of offsetting. In 2050, there will be nothing left to offset, because in 2050, we have to be carbon neutral, all of us. So which emissions are you going to reduce worldwide to offset aviation emissions? There will be none left. It's as simple as that. And therefore, it's high time to set the goal towards zero-emission fuels in aviation right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Allyson, I want to come back to you with a question about sort of the levels at which these types of engagements happen. We've been discussing a lot of national and international policies being pursued by state actors, oftentimes in institutions like IMO and ICAO, which are housed by the UN. Some of the efforts that you've mentioned and some of the work that Pacific Environment is engaged in is happening at the community level in ports, and yet there are transnational cooperative agreements and partnerships being forged at that level. Can you say more about the role of local communities in transnational policy alignment?
Yeah, I think a lot of these ports are local community driven, local community supported, and these are local economies we're talking about. So, in many ways, it's very critical to have the local community buy-in and also the local community push the ports to accelerate their efforts, to accelerate their ambitions. And so we're working to really activate those community groups, the environmental justice groups in those communities, to apply pressure on the ports to take more accelerated action. And by doing so, we're partnering also at the state level in the US, which is subnational, to apply top-down pressure on the ports. So combined, it applies this pressure that the ports need to act. And they can say to the state, yes, we're willing to participate in either a statewide effort or perhaps a transnational effort. And one that we're very proud to be supporting right now is through the Pacific Coast Collaborative, which is an alliance, a climate alliance between the US states of California, Washington, and Oregon, and British Columbia in Canada. And this is an alliance of these jurisdictions to work on a variety of climate issues. And we're very proud to have recently, as the jurisdictions recommitted to their climate ambitions in this collaborative, to include ships and ports and specifically address port pollution as they kind of undertake this next phase of their collaboration. And that type of transnational collaboration is very important, not only because we share airsheds across borders, right? Your airshed doesn't end where the border exists. That's particularly relevant here in the EU, but even in the US between states, these are not, your airshed is not confined to your jurisdiction, so the port pollution goes beyond these boundaries. So it's really important to have an aligned approach, both regionally and internationally, to ensure that we're addressing the same types of pollutants together and that we're working on a trajectory that is 1.5 aligned, which is zero carbon, zero emission by 2040. That's the real 1.5 aligned target that we're pushing for. And we look forward to bringing in more collaboration on the transnational level for not only the Pacific Coast Collaborative, but hopefully bringing that regional approach to other regions around the world on ports.
Thank you. Andrew, you have had you've been busy connecting with other countries and regions here at COP and elsewhere. Presumably you've heard lots of good ideas from lots of different partners, potential partners. I'm curious if there's anything during your time in this position that has really stood out as particularly insightful learnings or opportunities coming from other countries, coming from other partners.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'd say, it's actually auspicious that we are having this event on Solutions Day, because my sense is that there are both rhetorical solutions and policy solutions. We don't talk enough maybe about rhetorical solutions. The shipping sector, the aviation sector are difficult to decarbonize sectors. There's no doubt about it. But my sense is, it could be the case that provides a foothold for, some modicum of inertia where ambition is needed, particularly on this day, in this moment, and for our future. So I think in terms of, our rhetoric in this space, that matters too. And the good news is we don't have to be first movers in the United States. We don't have to be first movers around the world because there's already so many ports that are moving toward this direction. We just unlocked about $700 million in the United States within the past couple of months for this program that we have at our Maritime Administration, the Port Infrastructure Development Program. That program used to not include climate eligibility for things like electrification, master electrification, port planning, anti-idling infrastructure, resilience, and now it does. And so as a result, we were interested in what the results would be. And the results were, we have electrification, EV charging infrastructure at the Port of Oakland, battery energy systems. We have electrified investments up and down the East Coast and West Coast, Port of Long Beach, Port of Savannah. And that's not all. You know, you go internationally. We spoke to our Norwegian counterparts. They're moving to an electrified future. Talked to the port of Rotterdam. They're doing the same. You know, just got back from Argentina a few weeks ago. They are moving their electrified, or they're moving their rubber-tired gantry cranes to be hybrid electric. Everyone's moving in this direction. The question is how fast. Whether, you know, we are going to have a just transition, both in terms of disadvantaged communities and our workforce, you know, moving apace, and whether we collectively, you know, can create the momentum from this COP going forward to meet the moment. I think we can, and I think that there are some powerful lessons learned that we can share as best practices. So we sort of pre-butt this notion that it can't be done, because it absolutely can.
Thank you. Your reference to your recent trip to Argentina got me thinking that we've talked a lot about North America and Europe here. There's been a reference to Argentina, and a little bit of discussion of Asian ports. But for the most part, this discussion has been about, you know, alignment between countries in the global north, and, you know, that would frame this discussion somewhat. I'm curious. And I want to put this question to all of you, perhaps starting with Jutta. Are there opportunities for transnational alignment, policy engagements between countries in Europe, countries in North America, but also with countries in Latin America, like Argentina, countries in Africa, countries in Southern Asia?
Yes, I really believe so, because, I mean, it has already been touched upon. You said that we need common metrics for defining what is sustainable. And it would be disastrous if we had different approaches in the US, in the EU, in Japan, and whatever, because then, of course, an investor would say, okay, for which market should I produce? Which counts as sustainable in which market? And there, I think we really have to be careful not to point to, let's say, solutions that are limited, such as biofuels first generation, which really should not be counted as sustainable. I am not sure how the discussions are around this in the US. But of course, I think there is the need for regulatory alignment for these global businesses. And I think we have seen similar issues when it comes to cars, but with a car it's a different issue, because, for example, if a European car maker builds cars for the American market, he or she can look at the regulation, because the car will probably not come back to Europe to be driven there. It will stay there. But it's different with ships and airplanes, and that is why I think we should be really really careful in not setting standards which might be good for one country but not for another. For example, we were meeting with the incoming environmental minister of Brazil this morning as the European Parliament's delegation. And of course, in Brazil, which is a huge country with a, let's say, of course, they have a large population, but they have a huge, huge country. So she was like, yeah, of course, we are using biomass. We are using sugarcane to produce fuels, which would be a disastrous idea for Europe. And I think even for the US, it might be difficult to allocate sufficient land to produce biofuels for your car fleet, right? So therefore, I think we should have a look at which are solutions which are only good for one country but not for another, and which are solutions which would work for the whole world, before we set standards which would fall on our feet at the end of the day. I often cite the mistakes that Germany actually made in its Renewable Energies Act. It started out with bioenergy from waste being counted as renewable, which is okay, but then I will not tell the whole story, but at the end of the day, food and feed crops could be used to produce biogas. And that was disastrous, because what we saw is that land which was meant to produce food for people was then turned into maize for biogas, which makes up, I think, 12% of Germany's arable land today. And that was a huge mistake. So let's not repeat the mistakes globally.
I think that's such an excellent point, particularly in the need to come up with approaches that are not, specifically suited to one context that have application or applicability in a broader range of contexts, because the vast majority of transportation, energy demand, and transportation services right now are consumed in the global north. That's not going to be the case going forward. The growth in transportation energy consumption and transportation energy services is going to mostly happen in the south, and so we need to have policies, approaches, and principles that are globally applicable. Allyson, anything in your work that connects these efforts to ways that we might usefully engage with emerging economies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a huge part of our work in ensuring a just transition is making sure that we're providing for economic opportunities in the global south. And I think one of the challenges that we know about decarbonizing maritime is that hydrogen-based fuels are going to be difficult to transport, and they're also less energy dense. So ships either need to have larger storage capacity on their ships, or they need to bunker more frequently. So there is an opportunity to create new clean energy marine hubs globally, and that can be done in the global south, and we can create huge economies and very sustainable economies in these developing countries to serve as bunkering hubs for global shipping. And I think we've already started to see some of those start to pop up, with either hydrogen being produced that will be planned to be exported elsewhere, including throughout the global south, in Africa, in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia, to provide supply for the global economy. Because the U.S., as much as we would love to be a green hydrogen leader, we can't supply green hydrogen for the entire global economy. So that needs to be, we need hubs everywhere. And that's a key opportunity, because as we know, global trade routes they move all over the globe. So I think that's a really important way to ensure that we're providing economic opportunity for the developing countries. And also it helps support their economy more broadly, from transportation, and also the additionality of renewable electricity that would be added to the grid to support the electrolysis of hydrogen, can also support the electrification of those grids more broadly. So it's not just a solution for transportation, for aviation, for maritime, but it will also help stabilize and green those grids for
Thank
everything.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've almost used up all of our time. I just want to give Jutta and Andrea an opportunity to offer any closing thoughts, if you have any.
In addition to all of the investments in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, the two, landmark pieces of climate change legislation that President Biden has signed into law over the course of the last year, in the United States, the Department of Transportation is now planning to work on a maritime decarbonization strategy. So, our sense is, whether you're in the highway sector, the aviation sector, or the maritime sector, any of our modal sectors, we need clear, pronounced strategies as to how to decarbonize those modes of transportation. And that's really our goal going forward, is to make sure that we're looking at our transportation system as a system of systems, that everything is integrated into an overall climate decarbonization strategy. We're looking forward to moving that decarbonization strategy in a way that promotes a zero-emission future, and that connects to our transportation system. So, when we're thinking about our electrification strategy for highways, that integrates with our ports, our airports, up and down the supply chain. That's going to be critical for us, and it's going to be critical to share what is working and what's not globally, so that we can glean best practices and share them as well.
Thank you very much for organizing this. And what I really would like to point out, Although shipping as well as aviation are, let's say, not enthusiastic about additional costs being attributed to their sectors, those two sectors are cost inelastic. Because even if shipping were twice as expensive as it is today, it would still be much, much less expensive than rail transport or road transport. So this is a sector which can very easily pass on the cost to its consumers. And it's the same with aviation. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that flights didn't used to be so cheap. So yes, I mean, it's true. I've spoken to people who said, well, we flew to Barcelona to have a party over the weekend because it's less expensive than in Munich. And sorry, I mean, I'm really a fan of connecting people, but that's not what we need aviation for.
Yeah, I would just close by saying, you know, I think Andrew's point was very poignant in that the cost of inaction is the cost, right? That's the cost. When we're talking about acting, it's an investment. It's an investment in our future. It's an investment in these companies to sustain the impacts of climate change and to ensure that they will continue to be able to move their goods globally. So we should stop talking about the cost of acting and start framing it as an investment, because that's what it really is, and that's how we should be focusing and framing it for moving forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, for moderating too.
It's been my pleasure, and I want to thank everyone here for joining us today for this session. I want to thank Jutta Paulus, Andrew Wishnia, Allyson Browne, and joining us virtually, Andrew Bauer, for participating in this and helping us bring some of these issues and solution opportunities to light. This session will be available on the Clean Air Task Force's YouTube page soon. So I would like to thank you again all for coming, and please join me in giving a round of applause to our panel.